Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to respond to a question that a student asked me during my last tutoring meeting, which I think many students, maybe even some parents might wish to ask, and it's, why do we need to study Latin? Why in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy do we give so much attention to Latin studies? We live in the 21st century. No one speaks Latin anymore. Why do we need to study Latin? It's a good question. It's a good question, and I think that there are some good answers. First of all, I can tell you that when I was 19 years old, I was a sophomore in college when I decided to study Latin. So we could start and ask the question, why did I choose to study Latin? Why did I think it was important to study Latin? And I'll get to that in a little bit. But there's a simpler answer to begin with. In modern education, when you go through your high school studies, when you look at college admission, and we're not even talking about work yet, just college admission, high school diploma requirements, you're going to have to study a foreign language. So just sitting there and knowing English and nothing else is really not an option, especially in America, where we live in a culture that's diverse, where there's lots of different people living together. It's really not a good idea to go into adult life knowing only one language, even if that language is the language spoken by most people in the country. We're going to find that there are many different situations where being able to read or understand a foreign language is very important. So in modern high school requirements and in most admissions requirements for selective colleges, students are expected to study a foreign language in addition to their own native or birth language. So we have to study a foreign language. And the next question that arises is, if we have to study a foreign language, what foreign language should we study? If we have to study a foreign language, what foreign language should we study? Most kids in modern schools, they choose to study Spanish or maybe French. Some may choose an Eastern language like Chinese or maybe even Russian. But many of these modern languages, especially Spanish, French, Italian, and so on, many of them are derived from Latin. And so when we consider the different languages that we can learn, we have to pick one in school for our formal studies. And the question is it a good idea to pick a modern foreign language, or would it be a better idea to go back and study the mother language, Latin? And if we study the Latin language, it may help us to understand multiple modern languages and not just one foreign language. So if we're required to study a foreign language, it's better to be able to understand a number of foreign languages than just one foreign language. So we could make the argument that because you need to study a foreign language anyway, when you ask the question, what would the best foreign language be for study, my answer would be Latin, because Spanish, French, to some degree German, Italian, English, they all derive many of their words and vocabulary from Latin. So it sort of gives you an understanding that allows you to enter into all of those modern languages and maybe the best use of your time. For example, I've studied Latin and Greek. I've also studied Spanish quite a bit. I think I studied Spanish for almost 7 years when I was in high school and college. But I can also read French and Italian. And I can read French and Italian because of my knowledge of Latin and some help from Spanish. But ultimately, my Latin makes it easy for me to understand all of the modern, what are called Romance languages, Spanish, French, and Italian. I can understand all three of them, largely because I have a good knowledge of Latin. So because you have to study a foreign language no matter what, you have to choose a foreign language, I would recommend that you choose Latin as the foreign language that you study. Now, there's other reasons too. First of all, we're talking about what foreign language should you study during your formal school years. That's another part of this question. What foreign language should you study while you're in formal schooling, when you have access to teachers and tutors and textbooks and resources, and you have lots and lots of time to study? Should you study a modern foreign language during your formal school years, or should you study an ancient language like Latin during your formal school years? And I would again argue that it's smarter to use your formal school years to study a language that you would have more difficulty learning on your own after your schooling is finished. So if you look, you can find all kinds of resources to learn how to speak Spanish. You may live among Spanish people. You may have Spanish activities at your local church. There are apps where you can easily pick up conversational Spanish vocabulary and phrases and things like that. It's not hard to learn Spanish. You can easily find people to help you speak Spanish. But where are you going to go to find someone to help you study Latin when you're 30 years old? That would be much more difficult. And so while you're in your formal school years, I would argue you should choose a foreign language that you're not going to be able to study easily as an adult when your schooling is over. So make the most of your formal schooling years and study a language that would require more help when that help is available. Because like I said, there are many ways to learn modern foreign languages on your own as an adult, but not so much to learn classical languages. So classical languages are more appropriate for formal schooling. That would be my second argument. Thirdly, the English language is derived from Latin and Greek. And so in common everyday speech, it doesn't matter. But if you're interested in pursuing future studies in what are called learned professions like theology, science, medicine, law, and so on, what you're going to find is that when you enter into professional studies, the vocabulary becomes very technical. There's a language of each different field of study that has to be learned. And most of the technical words in the different fields, in the different learned professions, most of the technical terms, legal terms, medical terms, theological terms, scientific terms, they're derived from Latin and Greek. So when a student goes into those studies, goes into those fields to study with no knowledge of Latin and Greek, they struggle to learn the vocabulary. They have to almost memorize all the vocabulary because they don't understand the sources of the words, and they can't simply reason and understand their meaning just by looking at the words and thinking about their sources. It's much easier to study Latin and Greek and then use that knowledge to study the vocabulary in some different field of study than to try to master all of the vocabulary with no clue as to where those meanings are coming from. So even if you're interested in a professional study in the future, the knowledge of the languages from which all of the technical terms in those fields are derived is going to be very helpful. So that's another reason I would give you, because the vocabulary of professional fields of study, the vocabulary is derived from Latin and Greek, and it's sort of a shortcut to be able to master the language of those different fields. So that's another reason why the study of Latin and Greek is important. Another reason would be that Latin is the language of most of the history of the Catholic Church. If you go from, let's say, the 3rd century or the 4th century, so 300s AD, all the way through the 1900s, Latin is the official language of the Catholic Church. It's the language that the Mass was celebrated in. It's the language, most importantly, it's the language that most of the doctors of the Church wrote in. Most of the saints wrote and spoke when they spoke formally, as Catholics in the Catholic Church, but most importantly, when they wrote things. The writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, are in Latin. The writings of St. Augustine are Latin writings. So you can have access to the original writings of the saints and doctors of the Church through the study of Latin and Greek. And while many of them are available in modern translations, you'll find that sometimes the translations aren't very helpful. They don't clarify some important issues, and you're going to wish that you had access to those original writings. And even more importantly, there are many works that simply have not been translated into English. I have to deal with this all the time. In my work, there are so many valuable resources that have never been translated into English, because really the reason why books get translated into English is so they can be sold. So if there's a belief that they can sell a lot of books, then they'll go ahead and translate a book into English. But there are many books that are extremely valuable for study that aren't going to sell 1,000 copies, and so they don't get translated. And they're just sitting there in the original Latin or Greek, and no one can read them unless they study the classical languages. So access to the writings of saints and doctors of the Church, access to the original writings of the saints and even of the apostles, access to their original writings is extremely valuable, especially if you take religious or philosophical studies seriously. It's very important. So that's another reason why I would recommend the study of Latin. So, those reasons alone give plenty of motivation for the study of Latin. Of course, if you sit there and say, well, I don't plan on studying when I get older, so why should I study Latin? I would say you don't need to study Latin. If you're not planning on studying as an adult, if you're not planning on pursuing a knowledge of philosophy or theology, you may be right. All you may need is your native language so you can go find a job and just talk to people around you, where you live, where you work. You may not need any classical language studies, but is that really what you hope for in the future? You really hope to not pursue higher studies or devote your adult years to the pursuit of wisdom? You're not planning on doing that. You're just planning on living as a common person without the learning that's available to wise men. I don't know why you'd want to plan that for your future, but I think when you get to your adult life, you're going to look back and regret any decisions that you made as a child, to not take advice from the people around you and study the most valuable languages available to you when you had the opportunity to study in school. And I think just about everyone who you ask for advice as to what language should you study if you're going to choose a foreign language, and you give them a list of the languages that are available: Spanish, French, Italian, German, Chinese, Russian, Latin, and Greek. If you ask around for people's opinions what they would advise you to study, I'm pretty sure that most of them would tell you to look at the classical languages, especially if you ask wise people. And so you would be ignoring their advice and leaving yourself as an adult without the opportunity to have knowledge of the classical languages, and then you'd leave yourself as an adult with nothing but modern languages to work with. And I don't think that you would be happy that you made that choice when you're an adult. So take the advice of people around you. That's one of the signs of wisdom in a young person as a student. Ask advice, listen to the advice, and then follow the advice of people you trust, who you think are wise and have your best interests as their concern. And like I said, they're going to advise you to study classical languages. So those are some reasons. I'm sure we could think of others, but those are the reasons that I would give. You're going to have to study a foreign language. Might as well make it Latin. No matter what field you're going to go into, Latin is going to be beneficial. And like I said, when you look back as an adult, you're going to wish you took the opportunity to study Latin during your formal school years. So do yourself a favor in the future, make use of the opportunities you have, and learn the classical languages. That's my advice. God bless.